This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina and the Charleston Festival by Historic Charleston Foundation, celebrating houses, history, and culture with tours, concerts, workshops, and more. March 13th through April 13th. Learn more at thecharlestonfestivalsc.org.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. flocomuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. This week, Alfred Turner and I will be talking with Carolyn Click about her new book, The Cost of the Vote, George Elmore and the Battle for the Ballot.
Carolyn joins us to share the story of a man who believed with uncommon boldness that he and other Black Americans were guaranteed the right to vote. George Elmore became plaintiff in an NAACP lawsuit that successfully challenged the all-white Democratic primary in South Carolina in 1946.
Carolyn centers her story on Elmore, his family, his neighbors, and the activists and lawyers who filed the suit. Although Elmore's court challenge would prove successful, he and his family paid a steep personal price. Carolyn, it's great to have you back on the Journal after a few years, and we're here to talk about your latest book, The Cost of the Vote, George Elmore and the Battle for the Ballot. Now, I've known you for at least 15 years or longer, so our audience hasn't. So let's tell a little bit about yourself and how did you get to South Carolina, because you're not from here. You've been here a long time, but you're not from here.
I'm definitely a come here. So I'm a Virginian by birth and came here in the mid-'90s to take a job with the state newspaper. I've been a journalist. I was at United Press International in Richmond, Virginia for many years. And that, of course, ended when the wire service was diminished. And so started looking for jobs and got a job here at the state. My interest in George Elmore actually began at the state newspaper, and I'll tell a short story about that. There was a Citadel conference in 2003 that brought in a lot of the civil rights greats from the state, and I sort of saw it, and I think the newspaper saw it as a reckoning. Here we are finally going to analyze the past, and my topic, which was given to me by an editor, was think about voting rights in South Carolina. So I started researching old cases, and Elmore v. Rice came up. And frankly, I hadn't heard anything about it. And so I started writing about it. And I thought, gosh, I wish there was some way to humanize this story because it's just two names. So historians certainly helped me out at that point, but nobody knew a relative. And I finally found his granddaughter.
All right, so you were trying to find out about the man, and you're looking to talk about people now as much as events.
Yes, because as a journalist, that's what you do. You always say the lead, you have to have a person in the lead. So I needed somebody to humanize George Elmore. And eventually I started meeting members of the Elmore family. And I have to say that one of his grandsons said, well, we all knew about it, but nobody else would believe us, that he had actually challenged the white political establishment in the 1940s over the white primary.
Part of the story is why people don't remember George Elmore. But let's talk about the 1940s, because George Elmore was a pioneer civil rights activist. In fact, there was a whole group of folks from that day, James Hinton,
Majeska Simpkins,
McCrae,
Levi Byrd, yes.
Yes. The civil rights movement in South Carolina began in the 1930s.
Yes.
And was far better organized than most people realize. But part of the reason for that, as you know, was South Carolina was two separate worlds. What went on in the black community was often not understood in the white community. And so the NAACP was organizing in South Carolina, and George Elmore was part of that.
Yes. And I think you hit on a wonderful point, Walter. The 40s is really, to me, a crucial decade in the civil rights struggle in South Carolina. I teach a class in this at the University of South Carolina Honors College, and I always say to the students, tell me what you know about the civil rights movement. And they always start in the 60s. And they're kind of flummoxed that, people had laid the groundwork way, way back when. And so I also think of this decade as being terrifying for those folks, too. They had to face a lot of retribution, and they didn't often have the backing of the whole community because people were fearful.
Walter, about what time did the NAACP begin organizing South Carolina?
In South Carolina, they were here right after World War I.
Yes.
I thought it went back.
It goes way back, and it really took off in the 20s and 30s, even in small communities.
Mm-hmm.
And really, by the time of right on the cusp of the 40s, Levi Byrd, who was a plumber from Sherall, and really, they call him now the father of the South Carolina NAACP, he said, we've got to get our chapters together. And they became a state conference, and Reverend Hinton became the leader of that state conference. So I think they saw themselves as disparate little communities, and they had to fight together.
Well, one of the means of communication for the black community in South Carolina was through the railroads, where newspapers from up north, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Baltimore paper, were distributed. Florence was a major railroad point, and they would put these African-American newspapers on the trains going to Columbia, to Charleston, to Aiken, to wherever. And then they were disseminated in the black community.
And I think it's important that Columbia had two black newspapers. One, the Palmetto Leader, had been really active in the 20s, and they were anti-lynching, and they really put a big push on trying to win civil rights. But by the 30s and 40s, it had become more of a community newspaper. So John McCrae, who was the founder of the Lighthouse and Informer, began in 1941. And he really had these hard-charging editorials that I'm sure the white community read and were a little scared of, because he was saying, we can't be second-class citizens anymore.
The world of Black Columbia, and that's what we need to talk about in terms of George Elmore. The center of that community was around Allen and Benedict colleges, the Waverly neighborhood, as it was called. And it was a very self-contained world. In addition to the colleges, you had churches, lodges,
businesses.
And businesses. That's a very important part of it. In fact, if you drive down Gervais Street today, which in those days was just a two-lane street, there are still a few remaining storefronts from that black business district of the pre-1950s.
Yes. And George Elmore had a little five and dime store on Gervais Street. I have interviewed what I call my 40s children, and who have vivid memories of going inside, buying candy after they came from Waverly School, getting ice cream. And he also ran a couple of liquor establishments around that same area, and he drove a taxi. So he was very well versed in the neighborhood and beyond Waverly.
Well, you did do people like Gloria Shumpert James, who were part of that black community. And in fact, she has some very interesting, I've known Gloria for years, and she has some interesting stories about, they were a self-contained world, and they basically, the children ignored the white world that was just 5 blocks away down in 5 Points.
Yes. And in fact, she tells a wonderful story of her Sunday school teacher, who was the elevator lady in Haltewangers, which was a store downtown Columbia.
It was Haltewangers.
Haltewangers, yes.
And that was a very chic ladies' store.
So this elevator lady, her Sunday school teacher, was, operating the elevator when the case came to fruition, and the newspaper headlines say, the white primary is no more. And ladies walked in and were complaining because she was reading the newspaper as she was sitting on her stool, and they spoke of how disparagingly of the outcome of the trial. And she turned to them, her Sunday school teacher, and said, well, Jesus Christ was crucified. And she said she didn't say anything more, but then she came to Sunday school and told us the rest. So, of course, she explained more about the case and what he meant to the black community.
Well, we're talking about voting rights and a series of cases in Texas ending with Smith versus Allwright.
Yes.
In 1944.
1944.
Declared that the all-white primary was illegal. The U.S. Supreme Court, by an 8-1 decision, said that. So Governor Olin D. Johnson called the General Assembly into special session, and in a matter of days rescinded over 100 laws concerning voting from South Carolina statute so that the Democratic Party could become a private club. The late Bill Workman, who covered that, called it the Kill Billy session.
Oh, my goodness.
So many bills were killed.
Yes. And, it's kind of ludicrous today to think that you could say that a primary was a private club. They said it's sort of like belonging to the Forest Lake Country Club.
That is a phrase that South Carolina attorneys used at the Supreme Court. So the NAACP decides it's going to challenge the white primary in South Carolina. But they had to do it with somebody who was registered to vote, and George Elmore volunteered.
Yes. Now, it is interesting. He was not the original person that was probably wanted to be selected. What the NAACP would do would send out guinea pigs, they called them, to go register to vote. And it's hard to believe, but these registration books were in mom and pop stores. And so if the registrar, who was probably the clerk of the store, saw a black person come in to register, the books would just be slipped under the desk. So on the particular day that George Elmore was registered, 4 people had tried that day, and they were standing out on the corner and said, no deal, can't do it. And he said, can I give it a try? Now, George Elmore was very light-skinned, and so he could easily pass as a white person and had not done that, but obviously people mistook him. So he went into the store, and the 4 men are standing on the corner, and they go, wait a minute, he's drinking a Coke. The lady's talking to him, and they're laughing. And she says to him, these people are keep trying to vote, and try to register. I don't want them to do it. And she said, have you registered? And he said, no, ma'am. And she said, well, you need to register. So he filled out the form, and he got to his street address, which was 907 Tree Street.
Now, where is Tree Street?
So Tree Street is in Lower Waverly neighborhood. So she knew that was a black street. And she, of course, reacted in really a way that today we'd consider a racial slur. But she eventually let him register. And then she told the other men to come in, too. So whether she had a pang of conscience or just was worn out, or maybe she was charmed by him because he was very gregarious. And I think his business acumen probably paid off in that regard.
So he's registered now. So what's next?
So then he goes to the day of the white primary, which was August 1946. And I suspect that the Democratic Party knew that some people would try. And so he went up, tried to register, and he was turned away. And in the affidavit, John I. Rice, who was a Richland County Democratic official, said, you can't vote because you're not white. And that became the impetus for him to become the plaintiff in the case.
Well, weren't there some white party officials in Columbia and Richland County willing to open the polls?
Yes, and they took out a petition in the state newspaper to say, we think it's time for qualified black voters to be allowed to vote. And one of them, I went through his papers because I just was interested in him, Beverly Herbert. And he actually had, at the end, in 1948, after all the trial was over and the case was in Elmore's favor, he delivered the commencement address at the University of South Carolina. And he said, "Are we going to become a state of tricksters, willing to deny the vote to all these citizens of the state?"
So Elmore is denied the right to vote, and the NAACP handles the lawyers. Was Thurgood Marshall involved in this case?
Yes. So Harold Boulware was his Columbia NAACP lawyer, but Thurgood Marshall, who had argued the Smith case before the U.S. Supreme Court, came to argue this case. It was a 3-day trial. And interestingly, George Elmore didn't take the stand, but the lawyers, the state had a cadre of really impressive lawyers. And one of them said, "We don't know if George Elmore is a Democrat, a Republican, a populist, or a communist. He only wants to infiltrate the Democratic Party."
And the trial was in Charleston?
Trial was in Columbia. Yes. And apparently standing room only with many black spectators, including Matthew Perry, who went as a young man to see the trial.
And this is the old Richland County Courthouse,
yes,
which doesn't exist now. All right. So
let's just mention Matthew Perry, who went on to be a trailblazer.
To be a trailblazing attorney, federal judge.
Yes.
For whom the federal courthouse is named in Columbia today. So how did the trial turn out?
So within a month, Judge Waties Waring, who was the judge presiding over the trial, ruled in Elmore's favor. Now, he was also the judge who had equalized salaries among black and white teachers. So he already had thought hard about equal justice. So he quickly, within a month, decided the verdict and said that the idea of the Democratic Party erasing all these statutes and then saying, "Oh, yeah, we're a new animal," was ridiculous.
A private club.
Yes, a private club.
All right. The Texas case had already been decided by federal courts.
Yes.
But South Carolina kept going. And that's where your earlier quote, they made an appeal to the federal appeals court. And they actually said that Elmore had no more right to vote for the election of officers than he did to vote for the officers of the Forest Lake Country Club or for the officers of the Colonial Dames of America.
Can I just say, my mouth is hanging open here, I'm a little bit astounded at that argument.
And the federal appeals court, they upheld.
They upheld the verdict.
And South Carolina went ahead and appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refused to hear the case. And so, yes, in 1948, black voters could register and vote in the Democratic primary. And there are several famous photographs of that event.
Right. And interestingly, by this point, Strom Thurmond was governor, and his statement after the decision of the Supreme Court was it was un-American and unprincipled, and he said, "We shall meet this challenge with the coolness of our forefathers." So they were not going to give up. And in fact, a second lawsuit, Brown v. Baskin, emerged because the Democratic Party said, "Okay, we're going to open it to qualified blacks, but they have to take an oath that they believe in segregation."
And that lasted long enough until it got before Judge Waties Waring. And
yes, it was smashed.
So what's happening to George Elmore?
So after the case, he was, of course, hailed as a hero in the black community, but he began to start suffering economic repercussions. And I know you've talked about this before, Walter.
The squeeze.
The squeeze. So this was used by white people very effectively. White vendors refused to give him some goods on credit. His son recalls the Coca-Cola man saying, "I've got to turn off the Coca-Cola machine," those old-fashioned machines with the water baths running over them. The bread man refused to supply bread. So eventually the shelves of the Waverly 5 and 10 cent store just emptied. And people have recalled that, how he stood outside the store waiting for customers. But there was also a fear in the Black community of being too close to him, too.
Well, there were also some members of the Black community thought he had gotten rich off of the case.
Yes, and there was initially a $5,000 potential settlement, which never happened, that he never got rich off the case. His son, and I've never been able to verify this, but his son said, and he was young, men came into his liquor establishment and broke the seals on the liquor bottles. But eventually he lost his house, his mortgage was called, and unfortunately it was called by the Black-owned bank in Columbia, the Victory Savings.
There was a rift within the Black community over this case.
Yes.
John McCrae and his newspaper thought that part of the Black establishment, which included Majeska Simpkins and her kin, who owned the Victory Savings Bank, he thought there was something underhanded about Elmore losing his house.
We don't really know all the story there, and but he did express some sadness to his family that it was a Black bank that took the house away. And, I think that was wrapped into it was infighting or just the kind of argument that they had within the Black community.
Elmore's wife, the stress of the case, and we talked about the squeeze, but there were physical threats as well.
Yes.
Crosses were burned in the Waverly area on their street.
Yes, and there was, during the week of the trial, if you go back and look at the old newspapers, this to me was maybe even more shocking than the trial itself. So I looked to see if that was the lead story. In journalism, we say, okay, what's going to be in the old print newspaper? What led the paper? That story of the white primary did not lead the paper. The lead was the search for a, quote, armed Negro man who had allegedly attacked a white woman. And there was a posse of 500 men who came and started harassing, stopping Black people, and allegedly aiding the sheriff in this search. And no one was ever found. And finally, the NAACP said, you've got to stop this. And the sheriff—
That's the Richland County Sheriff.
That was the Richland County Sheriff disbanded the posses.
Well, Mrs. Elmore had a very difficult time. The threats of physical violence against her husband, she basically had a nervous breakdown.
Yes. So her children said that first she was hospitalized at the Richland Hospital, and then she went out.
Now, is this in Waverly Hospital?
Yes. And then she went out to what they call the Colored Mental Hospital.
Crafts Farrell.
Yeah, State Park. And they recall visiting her there. She stayed there until 1967. So this was after the death of George Elmore, after her children had left South Carolina to be raised by aunts in New York, her youngest children. And they took her to New York, and she stayed in a facility there until her death in 1993, I believe. So I went to check on her entrance and exit cards, which is all we have apparently.
Where are those records? State Archives?
At the State Archives. But there's no record of her full diagnosis, full papers from doctors, except there was one card which had her diagnosis, which said she suffered from syphilis of the brain. Now, I told Cresswell Elmore, her son, that there was dead silence on the phone. And he said to me, well, that's just one more infliction of pain that South Carolina has done to us. He didn't believe it. He doesn't believe it to this day. No one ever said to him or his family, oh, she has syphilis. But we also have to think about that. If that really was written on her diagnosis and her entry card, what that meant for us as a society.
Well, you found other entrances like that.
Yes. I mean, if you go back in time and you look at the mental health records, Black people had that diagnosis way more than white people.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry. I'm still taking a minute to let that sink in.
yeah.
Yes. And there's really no way to challenge that because the records, South Carolina destroyed all the records of mental health patients at the Colored Hospital and during the 50s. So we have no way to talk about that, really.
Erasure.
Yes. It's stunning to me.
The children are in New York, but George is still here.
Yes. Now, there were two older children, Cresswell and his sister Naomi. Naomi had graduated from Benedict College in 1952. And there is a last picture at Tree Street where she's holding her diploma. Her mother's there. This is before her mother was institutionalized, and two aunts, including the Aunt Esther, who she would go live with in New York to get on her feet. Cresswell graduated from Booker and went up there after graduation.
Yeah.
And then there were two younger children, Yolanda and Bernadine, and they stayed here with Lillian Edney, who was a niece of Laura Elmore's. And one of those cousins recalled the girls coming to stay with them, but George Elmore, they didn't have room for him, so he slept out in the truck outside along with Cresswell at that time. So he was trying to get back on his feet. He couldn't find work here. So Laura Elmore's niece did take care of those children, and eventually they went to New York. So all four children left South Carolina.
Art, he was a fairly good photographer.
Yes.
Did you ever discover any of his photographs?
I have not. There have been a few people who have said, "Oh, I remember he took my children's baby pictures," but I've not found any. Now, his picture was taken in the middle to late 20s by photographer Roberts, but we don't have any that he took, except he did take one of his wife, and we have that picture, sort of I would call it a glamour shot of his wife.
You mentioned the people like Gloria James that you interviewed. How did you figure out who to contact? Did you get those names from the city directories, and that's how you tracked them down?
Yes, well, it's sort of one person led me to another. Cresswell Elmore was certainly instrumental in this book. I mean, I probably couldn't have done it without him. He had so many memories, and he kept up with his Booker Washington classmates. He would tell me about them. I would go to them, and then they would lead me to other people. I suspect there's a few others that, I've not talked to that I would love to talk to that would expand the story even more. But one of the things that those children reminisced about was that sort of enclosed society that they had. And it was really, they had great memories and fun memories, but they also had this sense that things were sort of closing in on them in terms whenever anything bad happened in the white community.
Well, the boundaries were pretty clear of the Waverly community of Hardin Street, although some of the businesses were across the street from Allen and Benedict. The movie theater, the Victory Savings Bank, a small hotel. Again, as you mentioned, whether you were black or white, talking about growing up in Columbia in that time, it was separate worlds. And once you left 5 Points going on Hardin Street, you very quickly got into the Waverly area. And it came all the way down to Valley Park, but Valley Park was segregated.
Yes.
And the other side of Valley Park was a white middle-class neighborhood. The trolley line, until World War II, ran to Valley Park, where there was a dancing pavilion. So, you've got the world on the top of the hill enclosed and the world on the other side of the valley, which is enclosed.
And Valley Park is fascinating to me because black children couldn't play there, and often they would be like on the perimeter wall looking at the baseball games, looking at the swings, and several of the children said they would really like to just play games, and so they would run onto the grass and then tap it and run back just to prove that they could have stepped onto Valley Park. Now, that sounds very mischievous, but it's also, you just can't imagine what a little child feels like when they're on the perimeter looking in. And I've had several people who said their mothers would not let them look at the ball games because they wanted them to play in their own league, and they didn't want them to go down there and sort of look longingly at the ball games going on.
I hate to say this, but we need to start wrapping up. So let's continue with Mr. Elmore's story and take a look at the effect of what he did.
Okay. When George Elmore died, he died almost forgotten.
Yes, and he died in 1959, and I think about that. You know, he died before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He died before the Voting Rights Act of 65. But I did find an interview that he did in 1954. So this was when he was probably in pretty dire financial straits. But the newspaper, I think it was The Record, interviewed him. And he was still adamant that things were changing in South Carolina. And he predicted, this was early 1954, he predicted that the Supreme Court would end segregation in public schools. And of course, that happened in May of 1954. But he did say something else. He said, "I predict that South Carolina will accept the ruling without trouble." He got that wrong, but I do think it reflects this optimism he had, and maybe it was an unrealistic optimism. I like to say he was bold, but I also sometimes worry that he might have been a little reckless, that he thought too highly of his fellow citizens, that things would change.
Taking the stand that he did and becoming the guinea pig successfully in terms of the experiment, it destroyed his business, destroyed his marriage.
He lost his children, really, when you think about it. They moved north, so he wasn't able to raise them. Well, the older ones, of course, had already been raised, but the two younger ones. So it was that's sad to me.
Well, it is an intriguing story. It is important to remember the individual and not just the general story. Elmore v. Rice, people will see that case cited in history books without going into who was George Elmore. All right. Anything you'd like to say for our listeners today, Carolyn, before we sign off?
Well, thanks for being here, of course, Walter. It's always great to be with you. I guess what I really want to convey with this, and you would probably, I think, agree as a historian, this isn't my story. I would love it if there were more people that came forward to say, here, I know more about George Elmore, because I think that local expresses the universal. And when you have a person who steps out of line, as he did, it's really important to realize and understand the commitment and really the bravery that they exhibited.
Carolyn Click, author of The Cost of the Vote, George Elmore and the Battle for the Ballot. Thanks so much for being with us today on The Journal.
Thank you, Walter.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. In her new book, The Cost of the Vote, George Elmore and the Battle for the Ballot, Carolyn Click tells a story that many people don't know today. The suit that Elmore and the NAACP brought against the Democratic Party was an important step in establishing voting rights for African Americans in South Carolina nearly 2 decades before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. George Elmore persevered to the end of his life in his belief that black citizens of our state would win the right to vote.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.